What?
It stopped.
Yeah. Can't send a text message. It had to have been the 1080 thing. There's no way it wasn't that.
Is there any way to change it?
Not right now, there's not.
Well, welcome to week number 1 of a new series called Jesus Is, and we think that this is the perfect time of the year to really start taking a closer look in at the life of Jesus. But before we do that, I wanted to take just a second to talk to you about something that happened to me this week that I thought was very interesting. We've been at the house that we currently live in for a little over a year now, and we've done a ton of renovations and a lot of work to get it the way that we want it to be, to where we think it looks nice. And we were out, my wife and I, Nikki, we were in the backyard just a few days ago because it was fantastic weather outside, and we were doing some chores. Nikki was mowing the grass, I was cutting down weeds, and my neighbor to the left of me, on the other side of our fence that we put up, he said something to me. He said, "Hey there, neighbor, how are you guys holding up?" And I said, "Oh, we're holding up pretty good. How about you guys?" And he said, "Yeah, we're doing the same." Now, let me pause this story for a second to tell you, this was a weird conversation to have with my neighbor, mainly because I haven't talked to that neighbor since we moved in. Like, I've never talked to him or had a conversation with him until just a few days ago in this moment in this story that I'm telling you about. Because when I first bought the house, the person who previously owned it, we had a couple conversations, and I asked him about the neighbors around the houses, and he told me the neighbor to my right was a really great guy, and the people from across the street were really nice, but the neighbor to our left, well, he was a jerk, and he made his life complicated, and he really, really made it difficult for him to do some things. And so he said, don't waste your time getting to know him because he's only going to be a pain for you to deal with, and he's not a very nice guy. And so I, not knowing any better, I just assumed that he was right, and so I had gone out of my way, or not gone out of my way to say hello to him, but just rather to ignore him and never talk to him out of not wanting to complicate my life or not wanting to make my life more difficult than it needed to be. And so I just never said hello to him. Now, insert back to just a few days ago, I had about a 5 to 10 minute conversation with him, and he was a great guy. He was actually really nice, very pleasant to talk to. And I remember thinking, as I finished that conversation, this was not at all the person that I knew about, that I had learned about, that I had been informed about. In fact, after we ended our conversation, he introduced himself by name, and I said out loud, "Yeah, actually, I don't even know that I know your name. What is your name?" And so we exchanged names and had pleasantries, and I left that conversation going, wow, I really didn't understand who he was, and I shouldn't have taken the advice of the previous homeowner because I don't think he even knew who this guy was. I made some assumptions, and I acted off of them for a very long time based off of just what another person had told me about my neighbor. And I'm wondering if you've ever done that with someone. I'm wondering if you have ever operated off of or treated someone differently or handled a relationship with a person differently based on what someone else told you about it, not what you had discovered for yourself. Maybe a new student coming in. Maybe it was at the beginning of the year, you got into a new set of classrooms and someone you sat next to, you knew about them, not because you talked to them, but because you had heard about from some other person who this person was and what they did. Now, this series, Jesus Is, we're going to take a look in the four Gospels, and we're going to take a look at who Jesus is based on his character, what he teaches, what he does, and his very nature about how he handles situations and relationships. And we're going to start today in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. So if you have your Bibles, either a paper Bible like this, or if you have a digital Bible, I would encourage you to scroll through and to click on Mark chapter 8, because we're going to be looking at a story in the life of Jesus. Now, while you're flipping there, while you're scrolling there, let me just take a few seconds to say, if you haven't joined us for our live videos on Instagram, the past 2 days we've posted some Holy Week stories on our Instagram, and I would love for you to, on Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday, for you to tune in around 12:30 or 1 o'clock every day to update yourself in the story of Easter as we're currently experiencing it. And also on Sunday mornings at 11:30, we've been going live on our Fuse FCC Instagram, and we would love for you to join in on that conversation as we talk about questions that we don't know if it's okay for us to ask. So 11:30 on our Instagram live. We'd love for you to join us on Sundays. And then also every day this week, just hop on about 12:30 or 1 o'clock and join us for some discussion for Easter week. Hopefully you've gotten there. Mark chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 27. And let me set this up for you. Jesus, right before this, in like verses 22 to 26, has just healed a blind man. And so he's just done this crazy cool thing. And there are a bunch of crowds around, and Jesus is walking away with his disciples from this crowd, and he has this conversation with his disciples. Starting in verse 27, it says this: Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. That's just an area. Don't get hung up on that. It's just an area of land and mass that he's walking around. And on the road, while he was walking, he says this. He asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, this doesn't seem like that big of a question, right? But Jesus is asking people, what are people saying about me? Who do people say that I am? Because at this point, Jesus is healing blind people. He's teaching crazy, crazy things. And, well, they're not crazy, but they are to people at that time. And he's wanting to know, what are people saying about me? And he's not asking this because he doesn't know what people are saying about him. He can hear the crowds. And he's not asking this because he's looking for people's approval to like, oh, I got to know what they're saying. I want everyone to like me. He's not asking because of that. Jesus is asking this because he wants to have a conversation with his disciples. And this is the starting off question to get their thoughts going and get a conversation started. If you've ever watched a courtroom television show before, someone will ask a question of someone that's being interviewed as a witness, and someone might say, "Your Honor, I object. He's leading the witness." And they'll say sustained or overruled, because this is what Jesus is doing. He is asking a leading question that he wants his disciples to start thinking about. So he says, who do people say that I am? What are they talking about? And also, can I just take a pause here for a brief moment? What a great question to ask yourself sometimes. Because all of us are trying to figure out how to follow Jesus, and we're all trying to get feedback of how we're doing and how am I following Jesus, and what kind of person am I? What a great question to ask yourself. If you really want to find out, ask people who are closest to you or that you interact with. Who do people say that I am? What kind of person am I? And then give them the free response time to be able to just tell you without you getting defensive. And you can get some really great feedback from doing that. Let's keep reading in verse 28. It says this: "So they answered him," the disciples answered him. They said, "John the Baptist, and others Well, they say Elijah, one of the prophets. Now, here's what's fascinating. It would not be possible for Jesus to be John the Baptist, and anyone who would say that Jesus was John the Baptist just had no actual idea of what was going on, mainly because John the Baptist and Jesus lived at the same time. And when I say lived at the same time, I mean like they walked together and had conversations together. John the Baptist baptized Jesus. So it's not physically possible for them to even be the same person. But the people who were saying that probably had no understanding at all as to who Jesus was. And so they just associated him with John the Baptist. Now, Elijah is an Old Testament figure who is really, really legit in the Old Testament. And other people were saying that he's like Elijah, that Jesus is like Elijah. And here's why this is a big deal. Because Elijah did a ton of signs and miracles and wonders, and he spoke on behalf of God to the people. And so people are starting to liken Jesus with Elijah. They have some experience. They know things about the Old Testament and the history of the nation of Israel. So they're comparing him to Elijah. They compared Jesus to Elijah. But here's why those two names are actually important. Because both of those people, John the Baptist and Elijah, they both stood up to corrupt leaders and to systems of oppression and to things that weren't right or accurate. And so when Jesus gets this comparison of John the Baptist or Elijah, really they're saying Jesus is this person that is there to disrupt the system that we're currently in. Now, read with me verse 29 and 30. Verse 29, he says, "But you," he asks them. He turns and he stops and he says, "But what about you? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered to him, "You are the Messiah." And he strictly warned them to tell no one about this. And I want for you to pause for a second. Jesus is asking, well, who does this person say? Who do these people say that I am? And he stops and he turns and he looks right at them. And he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And here's the craziness. He's asking a very personal question to each one of his disciples, the people he's been walking with for a really long time, that have really gotten to know him. Who do you say that I am? It's a very personal question, and here's what's most fascinating. This happens 2,000 years ago. Some 2,000 years ago, Jesus looks across at humans and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And it's crazy because it's still incredibly accurate and important for us today to be able to answer that question. Who do you say that I am? Because there are some people that have only heard just faint whispers of who Jesus is, but have no idea. Like right now in your life, I know you're watching Fuse Live and you have your Bible open and you're like, "Jeremy, I'm in on this whole Jesus thing." But right now in your life, the people that you encounter on a typical everyday basis, when you're in school or when you're at work, or even people that you're Instagram followers for, they have no idea who Jesus is, and some of them have never even heard the name before. They might associate churches with good people or bad people or Christians, but have never fully understood who Jesus Christ is. And there are some people that are relying on what they've heard from others. For you right now in your faith, listen, the truth is this, that maybe for some of you, your beliefs and the things that you believe about Jesus and how you live your life are all just based on what other people have told you about being a Christian or about following Jesus. And you've never actually done first-hand investigation or looking at who Jesus is. And the question that Jesus asks is so important for you where you are right now. And listen, if you're on the far end of the spectrum and you're like, "Jeremy, I love Jesus. I go to church every Sunday. I watch 5 different church services now on Sunday mornings." That's great. I'm super excited that you do that, but I want for you to take note of one other thing. Verse 31, it says this, "Then he began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things, to be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and to rise after 3 days." He spoke openly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but rather human concerns." So listen, even the people that followed Jesus closely during that time, he had to tell them, this is who I really am. This is what I have to do. This is the role that I'm going to fulfill. And the person that knew him best had a struggle with that. Because the question of who do you say that I am, it's an important question. Dare I say the most important question that you'll ever have to answer. But let me just ask you, if you were sitting in a room, and if Jesus physically were sitting in a room with you, and he was sitting on the couch, and you were just hanging out, you were on Instagram, and he was just sitting there turning water into wine or doing something crazy, because that's what Jesus does. If you were in the same room as him, and he looked over, and he asked you, "Who do you say that I am?" what would your response be? What would your actual, honest response be if Jesus looked at you and said, "Who do you say that I am?" I think this is going to be the most important question you're ever going to need to answer in your life. Let me say it again. I think who do you say that Jesus is going to be the most important question that you're ever going to have to answer in your life. Because listen, I don't want you to follow Jesus based on what you've heard from others or from what your parents have had you to believe, or rumors about what you've read if you've never investigated. We have this phrase around here at Fuse, and it's very simple. It's we want you to know why you believe what you believe. We really do believe it. We want you to know why you believe what you believe, because it's only then do you actually take ownership of your faith. It's only then can you truly answer who Jesus is, when you take ownership and you know why you believe what you believe. Here's a scenario that I was thinking about. People do more thinking and investigating and discovery about picking a college. They do more discovery and investigating about what kind of shoes to save up for and to buy, what kind of phone, which gaming console they're going to buy, what they're going to spend their money on. People do more investigating and in-depth looking on those things most of the time compared to the time they spend investigating and discovering what's in this book and what they actually believe about Jesus and who Jesus is. And I hope that that's not true for you, but I think for most of us, myself included, some of that is accurate. Here's why this question is important. Because when we start to find out who Jesus is, like actually who Jesus is by reading in his word, studying his life, his character, his goodness, his teachings, the things that he represented, when we can figure out who Jesus is, we can start to answer the question, who am I? Let me say that again because I don't want you to miss that. When we can answer the question of who Jesus is, we can then start to answer the question of who am I? And that's such an important thing for you to discover and to figure out right now in your life. But the start of all that is figuring out who Jesus is. Because here's the truth. I didn't know my neighbor. In fact, I had only been operating off of what someone else told me about my neighbor. And when I took just a few seconds to pay attention, to ask questions, to be intentional about getting to know him, I found out that what I had been originally operating off of was not even close to being accurate. And maybe the same thing is happening for you in your life. That when you were younger, you went to church and you stopped going since then because you didn't like a person that was there, and that has informed your opinion of Jesus. Maybe maybe this week, maybe now in these next few weeks is your moment to start figuring out who Jesus is. Maybe you're doing this church thing and you're following Jesus and you've been baptized, and for you the next step is going, Jesus, I want to know who you are so that I can know who I am through you. It's an important question that Jesus asked. Who do you say that I am? Who is Jesus? It's a question that I think you'll want to find out the answer for. And I'm looking forward to getting to know my neighbor and finding out more information about my neighbor as time goes on. And I hope that you would look forward to getting to know who Jesus is and finding out more information on what that might mean for your life. So, Jesus is. Find out who Jesus is by answering the question of who do you say that I am? I would encourage you to keep digging into God's Word, to go online and to watch YouTube videos from people like the Bible Project or She Reads Truth and continue to get to know Jesus, not as this religious figure, this person who asked me to sacrifice things and who asked me to give up a bunch of things, but rather the person so that you could grow your relationship with Jesus and your faith could continue to grow in that process. Hey, listen, it's Wednesday. Friday's coming, but it also means that Sunday is coming too, and a lot can happen over 3 days. So we'll see you on Instagram Live. Have a great week. God bless you guys. Good night.